I wanted to spend a few moments talking about primary and secondary sources. Certainly secondary sources are very helpful. The problem is we can't usually access the data directly from them. So consider the following secondary source that quite a few of you found. This is a very appropriate secondary source. It would be extremely helpful if you were researching any possible racial bias in the criminal justice system. But it's secondary. So you find this in a couple ways. One, as you start scrolling along, you start seeing footnotes. When I see footnotes, I usually like to know what they're referring to. We'll do that in a second. It doesn't take very long, though, before even neglecting footnotes, we see that they're reporting information from other databases, the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Sometimes on websites you can mouse over the footnote. So here we have this is a paper from 2015. This footnote refers to some state data. They'll be at the end of the article. This footnote refers to census data. This footnote, just a comment. So they're drawing information from other sources. Look at this graph. Any good secondary source would describe where their graph came from. If they're not, I tend to be a bit more suspicious, because then I'm not able to view the data myself. It doesn't mean I always go and view the data. But here's the thing. Data doesn't tell a story by itself. People tell stories from data. So we track this information, who's being incarcerated, and we know all sorts of things. We know their gender and their age, their race and ethnicity, their crime, and so we have all this data about it. Now, people, researchers, can go look at that data, which is primary data, primary sources, and then look for patterns, look for stories. What is the data? What's in the data? And they might find something that they believe is present. So they create graphs, they write articles, they talk about the numbers, and they build a case. They have a position which is supported by the numbers, or a position that arose from looking at the numbers. So these secondary sources are really nice summaries. They let us know that there's all sorts of data. But if we want to tell our own story, or if we want to fact check the story being told here, then we want access to this data. All right? So let's just look at a couple more. All right, there's a big table here, and at the end of this big table, they tell us where this information came from. Here's a really nice graphic, which is a great representation of data, telling us how it changes by state. This is really helpful. It's this sort of thing that we would like to do. We want to make a secondary source, but in order to make one, we have to go to primary sources. Otherwise, we're doing something that's tertiary or fourth. We're getting further and further from the data. There's the danger when you look at secondary sources that you cherry pick those that tend to agree with what you're assuming to be the case. If we have a belief and we search for that belief, we will probably find plenty of secondary and tertiary sources that support that belief. They've represented the data that supports their position in a way that supports their position, which is not to say that they're disingenuous, only that the further we get from the actual data, the less confident we can be about our inferences. All right, so that's one. Again, this would be a great source to use to get data, but not directly. Well, I'll do another video on how we would find the data. Similarly here, we go looking at an article. This is an article on gender wage gaps. And it starts off with this paper reviews the empirical literature on the gender wage gap. Right from the get-go, this means they're not doing their own experiments. They didn't go and put surveys out to companies. They didn't interview people. And that's fine, except that they're going to use data that already exists to support a position. They have found, by looking at the data, some belief, or they have some belief from other evidence, and they're building a case here by looking at other studies, other evidence, and they're bringing it together. This is what's called a review article. Let's look at another article here. So same thing. Look, introduction. In this article, we review evidence that cannabis may be useful as a medicine. So if they were running their own experiment, it would be very clear. They would start by saying, we investigated the effect of a particular chemical or dosage. We ran trials. We had a control group. The introduction will be different. Again, these articles are valuable because they bring together lots of different research. They're great starting points. So, all right. So then the next video, I'll talk about tracking down the data.